bone and sickle, bleeding saints and forest witches, the past unburied, the books unsealed, the old celebration returning.
Hello, and welcome to my study. Please come in and have a seat. All the books surrounding you are those used to research our show, and the individual to my right here, along with managing domestic duties, serves as our reader for any passages that will be directly quoted from these sources. Her name is Mrs. Carswell.
Hello.
So, we are finally back for our first show of 2025. I hope our listeners enjoyed some kind of a break before launching into the year.
Yes.
You at least had a chance to get away and visit family, which I know can be a mixed blessing in your case.
Are you trying to get me to talk about Mother? That's what you want?
No. Not for my sake, anyway. I already heard about it. I just thought our listeners...
Mother was fine. You want me to talk about New Year's fortune-telling? About the bees, I assume.
Well, if you want to.
You're so amused by it.
No, it might be of interest for the listeners, though.
I know why you want to talk about the bees.
You do?
You know what Elaine says about you.
I don't even know who Elaine is.
A listener from England. She says you're passive-aggressive. That's the term she used. If you want to blame me and the bees for the clock, just say it. Tell all the listeners.
Okay, well, so why don't you tell me why beeswax was gumming up the clockwork?
Mr. Callenbach told you it was wax, not beeswax. I heard the whole thing when they delivered it. He said he couldn't understand it, and that some people used paraffin to clean the works, and that it could have been that. You put it in his head that it was beeswax.
And somehow paraffin used back who knows when just multiplied on its own and started gumming up the works suddenly?
Did he keep some to show you?
Thank you to our friends who listen to the show.
Sharing in our travels through tales of long ago.
Stories full of folklore.
Stories full of horror.
If you give us money, we will like you more.
And our heroes of the day are...
Sammy Hain, Kat Adair, Denise Flores, Stephen Lake, Unsuitable, and Jenna Norton.
Yes, thank you, all of you. And if listeners want to see the rewards you earn, including a short bonus episode every month, please visit patreon.com and search for Bone and Sickle.
He didn't save any?
Wax? Well, it could be some left on a rag or something. I don't know. It's been a while.
Did he say how wax would make a clock speed up?
Okay, well, this is episode 138, Mélusine, the Serpent Fairy. We're now in the middle of a medieval boar hunt and a number of pages into a story set down in 1387 by Jean d'Arras, Mélusine, or The Story of the Lusignans. The patron for whom this was written, Jean de Berry, belonged to the House of Lusignan in western France. And he and his family liked their name being associated with the supernatural figure of Mélusine. So Arras wove them together into a story, and the book he created became a sort of medieval bestseller. Now, as to this boar hunt, it was organized by a count the uncle of our 15-year-old protagonist, the character who will later marry Mélusine, that is, Raymondin, whose name is usually anglicized as Raymond, which is what I'll be doing. The boar in question is a real monster and is about to escape the horsemen.
Soon as horseshoes began to loosen, hunters began to fall behind, except for Raymond and the Count, who forged ahead until nightfall. They finally stopped beneath a large tree, and the Count said, "Nephew, we'll remain here until moonrise."
Raymond builds a campfire, and as they relax around the flames, conversation takes a strange turn. The Count, through the study of the many books in his vast library, has come to some conclusions about the stars' influence on man's fate. He turns to his nephew with a strange prophecy.
"If only you knew what a dire and awesome event I foresee, you would be overcome with dread. For this is the adventure. If, at this very hour, a subject were to kill his lord, he would become the richest, most powerful, and most honored man of all his line."
While Raymond mulls over the strange pronouncement,
from somewhere deep in the woods, they heard a great crackling of underbrush. Raymond seized his sword from the ground, and the Count unsheathed his. As they stood stock still, they beheld a monstrous boar charging ferociously straight toward them, spewing foam and gnashing its teeth.
the Count attempts to fend off the creature, but his weapon glances off the monster's hardened hide, and he's knocked to the ground under the slathering beast. Raymond strikes at the creature,
but he struck with such great force that the sword escaped him, slid over the boar, and pierced the kneeling Count through the navel. Raymond extracted the sword, dealt the boar a fatal blow, then rushed to the Count and sought to raise him, but in vain. He was dead.
overcome with panic and sadness, and still unaware that it's his own destiny predicted by his uncle, Raymond rides out into the forest.
At midnight, he came upon a fountain known as the Fountain of Thirst, which some called the Enchanted Fountain, because of a myriad adventures that had been occurring there for a long time. The sight was striking, a deep ravine flanked by steep cliffs, opening onto a moonlit prairie, extending through a valley beyond the edge of the forest.
Beside the fountain are 3 women of aristocratic bearing, one of them particularly beautiful, Mélusine, who addresses him by name and speaks knowingly of the incident with the boar.
In the name of heaven, Raymond, besides God himself, it is I who can best advance your cause in this mortal world, despite all your adversity, and transform your misfortune into prosperity.
She advises him that he must return to the Count's court in Poitiers, feigning ignorance of the accident, saying he lost his uncle during the chase. She offers more suggestions as to how he is to behave and what he must say, and makes more promises of great fortune that she will provide him. Dazzled and dumbfounded by all this, Raymond is suddenly ready to marry this mysterious woman, to which she agrees, but with a stipulation. Mélusine says,
Swear to me that never on a Saturday shall you seek to look upon me or inquire as to my whereabouts. And I swear to you, on peril of my soul, that never on that day shall I do anything whatsoever that will not bring you great honor.
Raymond finds the terms acceptable, follows her directions at the funeral, and later returns to meet her at the fountain. But the scene is somehow changed.
A stone edifice resembling a chapel caught his eye, though on several previous visits he had never noticed it. Out front, a number of ladies and maidens, knights and squires, welcomed him with great enthusiasm and respect, much to his astonishment. Raymond asked his lady where all these nobly attired people came from. "Do not wonder at that," she replied, "for they are all your people, in your service, along with many others who are not here now."
Raymond then visits his cousin Bertrand, now the Count of Poitiers, to request of him a payment of sorts for services rendered the former count, namely a parcel of land, but only as much as can be encompassed by the hide of a stag. All of this he does in accordance with Mélusine's directives. After the Count agrees to this meager request, Mélusine tells Raymond he
will meet a man bearing a sack containing a stag's hide, tanned with alum. Buy it at the price he names, and have it very carefully cut into one long, extremely thin strip.
And so it goes. Afterwards,
at precisely that moment, men dressed in coarse clothing arrived and said they had been sent to help them. They wound the hide into a ball and sent it a long way down into the valley. They drove a sturdy stake as close to the crag as possible and lashed one end of the hide to it. One of them was carrying a large bundle of stakes.
Thus is laid out the perimeter of a vast tract upon which will be built the castle of Lusignan. While only foundations and a keep remain of the structure today, residents of the namesake town that grew up around it still are referred to as Mélusines. Now, suspicions surrounding this mysterious woman Raymond is about to marry are greatly increased when guests show up at the wedding.
Down on the prairie, they saw such a mass of tents and spacious, ornate pavilions that they were incredulous. They also beheld a noble-appearing throng of ladies, maidens, knights, and squires, and a multitude of horses galloping across the field.
The celebrations last 2 weeks include jousting, a ball, and feasting on
a rich variety of fine foods, excellent wines, delicate pastries, and spiced mulled wine, all served so copiously, it made the guests wonder greatly about the source of such abundance.
Well, fairies, obviously. A peculiar kind of fairy magic is employed by Mélusine as she goes on to build Raymond's empire. Castles aren't just magicked out of thin air, but the legions of workers and their wages and provisions seem to be. In this manner are constructed a number of castles around Poitiers, the coastal watchtowers of La Rochelle, and the entire town of Patron. Mélusine also encourages Raymond to mount campaigns in Brittany to reclaim hereditary lands and sees to it that fortresses are likewise built there. Now, a little context to all this. As mentioned, our narrative was commissioned by Jean, Duke of Berry, Count of Poitiers, and Lord of Lusignan Castle, the one built within the hide of the stag. Arras composed the tale during the 100 Years' War, during which French ownership of the castle was contested by the English. So, an account providing details of its construction as a matter of supernatural destiny would have pleased the Duke. If a fairy story seems an odd way to accomplish this, bear in mind the mythologized origin stories we've already heard about in previous episodes. The founding of London by exiles from Troy in our Giants episode, or various Spanish cities said to be founded by Hercules in our Sorcery Schools episode. And the House of Lusignan was not the only family to imagine Mélusine as a founder. The Limburg-Luxembourg dynasty also made this claim, as did the rulers of Bohemia and Hungary, descended from John of Luxembourg. In England, a supernatural figure, the Countess of Anjou, later equated with Mélusine, also appears in the lineage of 12th and 13th century kings of the House of Anjou, that is, Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and King John, and by extension, the Plantagenet rulers descended from them. In his late 12th century work, On the Instruction of a Prince, Gerald of Wales relates a story of the Countess of Anjou, describing her as
a remarkable beauty,
who was
in the habit of coming very seldom to church, and there manifested very little or no devotion in it.
Gerald remarks that she always disappeared shortly before communion was administered, and that suspicions about this increased within the parish and noble family, so that
one day as she was preparing to depart at her usual hour, she saw that she was kept back by 4 soldiers at the command of the Count, and immediately throwing off the robe by which she was held, and leaving there with the rest her 2 little sons, whom she had with her under the right sleeve of her robe, she took up under her arm the 2 others, who were standing on the left, and in the sight of all flew out through a lofty window of the church. And so this woman, more fair in face than in faith, having carried off her 2 children with her, was never afterward seen there.
Gerald notes that King Richard was fond of relating this incident,
saying that it was no matter of wonder if, coming from such a race, sons should not cease to harass their parents, and brothers to quarrel amongst each other, for he knew that they had all come of the devil, and to the devil they would go.
While Jean d'Arras goes to great lengths to conform his Mélusine to expectations of a pious Catholic society, as would have pleased his patron, there's a Faustian undertone to her support of the House of Lusignan, and along with this, hints of monstrous secrets barely concealed. This balancing act is particularly clear in his description of the 10 sons Mélusine bears Raymond. 8 of the 10 born are described as extremely handsome, but marked with some unmissable physical flaw. The firstborn, Urion, has 1 red eye and
the biggest ears anyone had ever seen on an infant. As he grew, they became as large as the handles of a winnowing basket.
Renaud has only 1 eye, though it's capable of
seeing things such as inbound ships and objects on land at a distance of some 21 leagues.
Geoffroy is
huge, tall, unusually muscular, and powerful,
but nicknamed Geoffroy Big Tooth thanks to
1 tooth that jutted out of his mouth more than an inch.
And Antoine is
born with a lion's paw birthmark on his left cheek, which before he was 8 years old grew fur and sharp nails, causing him to be much feared.
Worst of all, one eventually dubbed Horrible, who
was monstrously large, had 3 eyes, 1 of them on his forehead, and was wicked and cruel.
A good portion of the narrative is devoted to the adventures undertaken by these sons, particularly their exploits as crusaders fighting Saracens, and how 2 of the sons became kings of Cyprus and of Cilician Armenia, a region of Turkey's Anatolian coast, across from Cyprus. Some of this alludes to actual events in which the Lusignans were involved, but it's largely myth-making. And we'll skip ahead to get to our central drama, which is back in France. Raymond happens to receive a visit from his brother, the Count of Forêt, on a Saturday. The Count inquires after Mélusine, and Raymond admits to the liberties he allows to his wife on that day, something the Count had apparently intended to address, saying,
Fair brother, it is rumored hither and yon that every Saturday your wife dishonors you. Nor are you bold enough, so blinded are you by her, to find out where she goes. Some say she's an enchanted spirit who does penance on Saturdays. Personally, I don't know what to believe, but as your brother, I must not conceal your dishonor from you or tolerate it, and that's why I've come here today. Whereupon Raymond shoved the table aside and stormed off to his room, seething with anger and jealousy. He seized the sword suspended at the head of his bed, buckled it on, and strode straight to the place where he knew Mélusine went on Saturdays. He had never ventured there before, and found himself confronted by a very thick door. He unsheathed his sword, thrust, and turned the point into it until he had hollowed out a small opening. Peering through it, he saw a huge marble basin with steps descending into its depths. It was a good 15 feet around, with a rim fully 5 feet wide, and therein was Mélusine, bathing in the manner I'm about to describe. Through the aperture, Raymond could see everything in the room, including Mélusine in the basin. Here, combing her hair, was a woman who, from the navel down, took the form of a massive serpent's tail, extremely long and thick as a herring keg, and splashing the water so hard that it splattered the vaulting of the chamber. Raymond was suddenly overcome with remorse. "Ah," he lamented, "my love, at the wrongful behest of my brother, I have betrayed you and broken the promise I made you."
Strangely, Arras says nothing of feelings of horror, betrayal, and repulsion you might expect of Raymond. But there are plenty of paragraphs of him bemoaning his disloyalty. Any anger he feels is directed towards his brother, the Count, whom he angrily drives from the house. We then hear a bit more about his son Geoffroy, the Big Tooth that is, battling a giant by the name of Gardon, who's been harassing the people of Gironde, a town to the north. He does battle with the giant, who's armed himself with
a metal whip of 3 chains
and a scythe with which he hacks off the hindquarters of Geoffroy's mount. But the giant is beheaded by the knight, and the head is carried back to Mervent as a trophy for his father. Raymond is very pleased, of course, about the enormous bleeding head, but is quickly distracted by a letter from his other son, Serpent, asking for permission to become a monk, which he ends up granting. Geoffroy is a bit of a hothead and does not take the news well.
He was so distraught that he took leave of his senses. Indeed, he seemed to be insane as he screamed, "What? Do not my father and mother have the wherewithal to make Froment rich, to give him good lands and good fortresses, and marry him well, instead of making a monk of him? By God's molars, those lecherous monks have cast a spell on him and lured him in there to advance their own interests."
He charges off to the abbey and confronts Froment, who assures his brother he joined up of his own free will, but Geoffroy rages on.
"No one will ever blame me for letting a brother of mine become a monk." He stormed out and saw to it that every possible exit was tightly sealed. Then he made all the servants heave hay and logs in among the monks, and swore by God he would reduce the whole lot of them in there to ashes.
Even Geoffroy's own knights try to stop him, but he
lit a torch from a lamp in the church, hurled it into the straw, and the logs ignited. What ghastly horrors you would have seen and heard! The moment the monks felt the flames, they began to moan piteously and then scream in agony, but all in vain.
Geoffroy rides from the scene, but within a few miles, he stops, suddenly realizing at that moment that perhaps he overreacted. When Raymond hears what his son has done, he turns his anger on Mélusine, saying,
"Ah, you deceitful serpent! By God, you and your deeds are nothing but phantoms, nor will any heir you have born ever come to a good end. Fromont was the only good being to issue from you. Now he has been destroyed through the malice of the devil. That's obviously why Geoffrey committed such a colossal, hideous crime, immolating his own brother and all these monks, none of whom deserved to die."
Mélusine collapses in a brief swoon, but then confronts Raymond, revealing that she knew that he'd spied on her in the bath, but having told no one of it, she would have forgiven him. But now, she declares,
"Our love has turned to hatred, our tenderness into contempt, and our good fortune into irreversible calamity. Alas, if you had not betrayed me, I would have lived out the full course of a mortal woman's lifetime and died naturally. Now you have cast me back into the dark abyss of penance. Never again shall you see me in female form."
She hints that her serpentine form was inflicted as a sort of punishment, from which their union was supposed to have redeemed her. But
then, as lightly as if she had wings to fly, Mélusine leapt to the sill of one of the windows of the room that looked out across the orchards and fields toward Lusignan. Uttering a very doleful cry, she leapt from the window into the void. As she swept across the orchards, she transformed into a massive dragon, some 15 feet in length. She circled the fortress 3 times, and each time she flew past the window, she uttered such an excruciating, desolate cry that everyone wept for pity, knowing that she was leaving under constraint and against her will. Then she disappeared, letting out such rueful shrieking that whenever she passed, it seemed as if the lightning and thunder were about to split the sky.
But even before we see Mélusine in this form, recall that Arras has given us hints of a monstrous nature passed on to her progeny, particularly the child named Horrible. This is not merely a reference to his physical shape, his 3 eyes and monstrous size, but, as it turns out,
before the age of 4, he had killed 2 of his nurses.
And later, Raymond reveals that the child,
who is not yet 7 years old, has slain 2 of my squires.
Shortly before her departure, we hear again of Horrible, when Mélusine orders that he must
be secretly put to death. Otherwise, he would do such damage that the loss of 20,000 men would be as nothing compared to it, for he would surely destroy everything I have built.
And so, later, they
led Horrible into a cave, using a pleasant demeanor and soothing words to allay any suspicion or resistance on his part. They sealed him in and suffocated him, using smoke from wet hay.
A grim scene. But on a somewhat happier note, after Mélusine's departure in the form of a dragon,
Raymond learned from the nurses that Mélusine was coming to visit them every evening. It greatly eased his sorrow and gave him hope that he might yet recover her and have her with him once again. But it was no use. Never again would he have her by his side, nor see her in woman's form, although since then many others have indeed seen her.
That is, as a dragon flying over Poitiers, lamenting her loss or warning of a coming misfortune. There's still some of Mélusine's backstory to reveal. Arras, in earlier passages, provided this material, but then reuses it as a not very surprising revelation later being where we just left off after Mélusine's departure. Anyway, this is how she assumed that snaky form. Geoffroy has received a missive from the residents of Northumberland begging him for help against a giant by the name of Grimaud. By now, the knight has something of a reputation for slaying giants, but there's another reason he's been sought out. Those who study the stars have decreed that only Geoffroy can accomplish this task. The giant killer happily undertakes the journey to Northumberland and, upon arrival, finds
the giant sitting beneath the tree. When he saw Geoffroy, he was astonished that a lone knight would dare approach him. In a very foul mood, he rose and seized a cudgel so huge that even a very stout peasant would hardly have been able to lift it.
Geoffroy makes his attack, but the giant escapes into a cave opening into a nearby mountain. The knight gives chase, finding that
the passage widened into an opulent chamber filled with a profusion of riches. There were large gold candelabra, all a-glitter, so that the room was as bright as day. In the center of the room was one of the most ornate tombs he had ever seen, inlaid with gold and precious stones. Upon it lay the statue of a knight, amazingly tall, wearing a golden crown set with countless gems. At the knight's feet stood a queen, sculpted in alabaster, richly crowned and holding a tablet that read, "Here lies my husband, the noble Elianos of Scotland," and recounted how and why he had come to be there. It told of how their 3 daughters, Mélusine, Palestine, and Melior, had been punished for imprisoning their father there, how the giant had been stationed there to guard the tomb until an heir of one of the daughters would cast him out.
And so, as the stars foretold, Geoffroy Bigtooth, son of Mélusine, is that promised heir. So, of course, he goes on to find and kill the giant, but let's focus on the tablet held by the statue and the story it reveals. Mélusine, as it turns out, was indeed the child of the Scottish king Elianos, the knight whose tomb it is, and his fairy wife by the name of Pressine, represented by the alabaster statue. While out hunting, it seems the Scottish king had met the fairy by a fountain, is enchanted by her beauty, and wishes to marry her, as these things go. She agrees, and of course has an all-important caveat. Nothing to do with Saturday bath time, but rather,
"If we have children together, you will never in any way undertake to see me in childbed."
Which, as we know they do, 3 half-fairy daughters. However, through the machinations of the king's ill-willed son by a previous marriage, Elianos breaks his promise, and Pressine angrily flees with her daughters to Avalon, home of the Arthurian Lady of the Lake, whom we learn is Pressine's sister. Not everything's great in Avalon, however, as the daughters constantly witness Pressine mourning her betrayal by Elianos. Moved by pity and being the eldest of the 3, Mélusine takes it upon herself to punish the faithless king, imprisoning him inside a mountain in Northumberland, and setting that giant there to guard him. However, Précine is hard to please and curses Mélusine for this treatment of her father, saying,
"The power of your father's seed would eventually have drawn you and your sisters toward his human nature, and you would have soon left behind the ways of nymphs and fairies forever. But I proclaim that henceforth every Saturday you shall become a serpent from the navel down."
So, now that that's tidied up, a few more plot points to draw our story to its close. Back to the time just after Mélusine's departure in dragon form. Geoffroy is still on a rampage, and having learned that it was his uncle, the Count of Flourish, who prompted Raymond to break his trust with Mélusine, pursues his uncle into a fortress perched on a mountain peak. The knight then
pursued him from floor to floor until they came to the top of the tower just beneath the roof. Terrified of dying, the Count attempted to jump onto a small shelter nearby, but lost his balance and plunged downward, bouncing off the rocks as he fell. Before he hit bottom, he was already dead, his body shattered. Geoffroy saw him lying far below, in a hideous posture, but felt no pity.
And now it's all over but the regrets. Raymond and Geoffroy, one after the other, ride off to Rome to beg the Pope to direct their penance. Raymond ends up in Spain, in Aragon, at the hermitage of Montserrat, spending days in prayer inside a small cave on a remote crag. And Geoffroy rebuilds the monastery he burned to the ground during his tantrum. Now, Raymond's sons visit him every year at the hermitage, but as they prepare for their final departure,
the dragon appeared above the ramparts so that all could see her and circled them 3 times. Then she perched on a tower and uttered grievous laments and shrill cries so that it seemed as if the fortress were collapsing. Then she rose into the air and flew straight at Aragon. That very day she appeared at Montserrat.
Raymond has died by the time the sons arrive. His body is
prepared and embalmed, and the heart extracted, burying the entrails before the main altar in the lamplit chapel.
Thereafter, the sons
took their father's heart with them. In each town where they spent the night during their journey, they had candles placed around it, and whenever possible they arranged for monks to recite psalms and vigils throughout the night.
And as the sons returned to Lusignan,
the heart was buried with great ceremony.
Thus closing our story of Raymond and Mélusine. Arras includes more adventures of the sons, but we'll leave it here. Those who've heard our Banshees episode might recognize some parallels to the figure of Mélusine. Like the Irish spirits, she was attached to a particular noble family, and her shrieking served as an omen of impending death. Her Scottish cousin, de Benigné, is associated with water, streams, or lakes, if not a fountain. And this figure's appearance by a lake or stream washing bloody clothing was recognized as an omen of imminent death. Even more relevant geographically would be the Breton folklore of the Le Vendière, the midnight washerwomen, who performed the same function. Well, that's one aspect matched, but other figures match both the association with water and the tendency to marry mortal men. In particular, the Selkie wives of Scottish and Scandinavian lore, women who normally appear as seals but can remove these outer skins to reveal a human form, and often, so the stories go, have these skins stolen by men hoping to keep them as wives. Irish lore offers similar stories of mermaids or the marrow maidens who marry mortals and disguise themselves by magic. And Welsh stories describe marriages between mortals and the dames of Elfinland, the wives of the lower world, or lake maidens. I notice I've avoided the unpronounceable Welsh name. These figures come from a lower world hidden not by earth, but beneath the water. It's been suggested that the Arthurian Lady of the Lake, mentioned as a relative of Mélusine, originates in such folklore. So there's all that. None of this, of course, accounts for her appearance as a serpent or dragon, which for the medieval Christian audience is clearly diabolical. The fall from grace instigated by the forbidden glimpse of Pricine's femininity, as represented by her likely unclothed appearance in the birthing bed, or Mélusine's definitely naked bath time. All this combined with her serpentine form are all very evocative of the Eden story and the medieval image of Eve as a vehicle of sin. So all these stories offer interesting thematic parallels, and even more remote sources have been suggested for the character of Mélusine, far-flung notions about Scythian or Babylonian mythology, but there are much more immediate sources, some of which were definitely available to Arras, literary sources offering a rudimentary version of Mélusine's story. Arras even mentioned one of these in his prologue to the book. Gervase of Tilbury, who in his Entertainments for an Emperor, written around 1210, writes about
a knight named Roger of Rousset Castle in the province of Aix, who came upon a fairy and wanted her for his wife. She consented, on condition that he never saw her naked.
Curiosity later gets the best of him, and he spies on his wife while she's bathing.
Whereupon she plunged her head into the water, became a serpent, and was never seen again.
And there are older literary parallels. Marie de France, from whom we've heard a medieval French werewolf tale, around 1160 wrote an Arthurian story, L'Enval, the name of Arthur's steward, who secretly marries the fairy. And, as with Mélusine and Raymond, she increases his wealth and standing, all of which vanishes when he reveals her existence. And roughly 20 years later, the English courtier Walter Map, in his Trinkets for the Court, tells the story of a Norman noble by a name similar to Geoffroy Bigtooth, that is, Henno with the teeth. As in our story of the Countess of Anjou, Henno's wife comes under suspicion for avoiding the Eucharist during Mass. In this one, it's Henno's mother who takes the initiative, following the woman as she slips out of the church and discovering her in her bath in the form of a dragon. Her maid is apparently in on it too, and when the priest is called to sprinkle the two with holy water,
with a sudden leap, they dashed through the roof and with loud shrieks left the shelter they had haunted so long.
There's also Vincent of Beauvais' The Mirror of Nature, written around 1350, which has a fairy transforming into a serpent when spied upon bathing, and Jacques de Longueillon's chivalric work, The Vows of the Peacock, from around 1310, which tells a version of the Countess Anjou story. The most relevant would be a sort of dictionary reference volume for clerics, Repertorium Morale, written around 1250 by a monk, Pierre Bessure, who references the site-specific legend that Arras must have worked from.
In my country of Poitou, it is said that the very strong castle of Lusignan was built by a certain knight and his wife, who was a fairy. and that this fairy gave birth to a multitude of nobles and great men, and that from there draw their origin the kings of Jerusalem and Cyprus, as well of the counts of Le Marche and Parthenay. It is said, however, that the fairy was seen naked by her husband and was transformed into a serpent. And even today the rumor goes that this serpent appears in the castle each time it changes lords.
The version of the Mélusine story told by Arras was rewritten 14 years later in 1401 by a French writer about whom we have little information, including his name, Coudret, which has been variously spelled. It's virtually the same tale, but it's worth mentioning as this was the version translated into German in 1456 and widely circulated as a chapbook, spawning other iterations. Spanish versions began appearing in 1489, and a few years later English, Dutch, and Czech translations appeared. Most all of these divorced Mélusine from her association with the House of Lusignan. Her story was particularly popular in the Low Countries. In Luxembourg, it attached to Siegfried, Count of the Ardennes, who's regarded as the founder of Luxembourg after rebuilding an old Roman fortress on the Alzette in 936, which became Luxembourg Castle. And the story: while out hunting, Siegfried is said to have been attracted by the singing of a beautiful woman, a nymph on a rocky prominence by the Alzette. Madly in love, Siegfried instantly asks her to marry, to which she agrees, with a few conditions, that is, no questions about her Saturday activities, of course, and she must also remain on the cliffs where he found her. Siegfried agrees, and with a bit of magical assistance from Mélusine, Luxembourg Castle springs up on the spot. As you would expect, curiosity gets the better of Siegfried one Saturday, and through a keyhole, he spies Mélusine in her bath, half human and half fish rather than serpent. With a shriek, Mélusine sinks down into an abyss opening below her into the rock upon which the castle now stands. However, that's not the end of the story. As in the tale by Arras, Mélusine's union with the mortal, had it continued happily, would have redeemed her. In the Luxembourg version, she's said to arise every 7 years from within the rock, appearing in ghostly form and asking men to redeem her by their love. Failing to find this, she flies over the city, crying,
"Not for another 7 years."
Mélusine's dreadful howling is also said to be heard whenever the city is in danger. From the 17th century onward, legends of Mélusine in Germany also portrayed her as half fish rather than half serpent. She is a water maiden in a story appearing in the 1862 volume, Legends and Fairy Tales of the Upper Harz. There, she is presented as the owner and sole resident of an enchanted castle discovered by a knight wandering through the forest. Staying for a few days, he falls in love and asks her to marry. And in this case, it's on Friday that the knight must mind his own business. But curiosity is a powerful thing.
He finally came to the cellar, where he found a door. Opening it, he saw his wife, half fish and half human, swimming in a small pond. When she saw her husband, she cast a sad and serious glance at him, and then disappeared.
Another version, told in the 1853 volume German Book of Legends by Ludwig Bechstein, also emphasizes Mélusine's desire to redeem herself through marriage to a mortal. It describes a youth riding through the Stollenberg forest, hearing a lovely voice from the nearby mountain. He approaches to find a female spirit singing,
Redeem me, just kiss me 3 times 3.
As he draws closer, he's startled to find that the beautiful woman is only partly beautiful. Her hands appeared to be webbed, and
she had no feet at all, but rather a snake's body. Nonetheless, the youth fearlessly gave the spectre the first 3 kisses.
strangely, he agrees to return to kiss her on 2 more occasions. On his second visit, however,
he saw that now she had wings. Her snake's body was speckled green and ended with a dragon's tail. But Mélusina's eyes and face emanated such beauty, and her mouth was so seductive, that he was overcome by desire, and he again gave her 3 kisses. She quivered with lust and desire, flapping her wings about his head.
And on the 3rd visit, it's even worse.
For Mélusine now had a toad's head, and the lover was supposed to kiss it as though nothing had happened. But instead, he turned his heels and ran away as fast as he could. Behind him, he heard a rushing sound and cries of anguish.
This German story seems to borrow less from the Arras tale than from the verse novella Peter von Stauffenberg, which predates the Arras version by 77 years. Over time, this 14th century narrative seems to have passed into the realm of folk tale, one told in Volume 2 of German Legends by the Brothers Grimm. By this time, the fairy in the story has acquired the name, Mélusine in German. The Grimm's account describes the knight, Peter von Stauffenberg, passing through a forest where he encounters
a beautiful, richly bejeweled maiden sitting all alone on a rock.
She speaks to Peter, saying,
"I have been waiting here for you. I have loved you since you first learned to ride a horse. I have secretly watched over you and protected you with my own hand, keeping you from harm in battles and in wars, on roads and on byways."
Seems like wife material to the knight. And when he proposes, she lays out the terms, saying that she can only be with him when he is alone, that whenever he wishes for her, she will appear. Terms accepted, Peter sees his fortunes increase as she had promised. But friends and family don't like this secret wife no one can see idea. Eventually, Peter succumbs to pressures and agrees to marry a visible wife. Mélusine visits before the marriage, warning that she will make a final appearance at the wedding, after which he will have 3 days to prepare for death. At the feast, there's something strange about the ceiling, which opens to reveal
a beautiful human foot up to the knee, as white as ivory.
It's a particularly weird detail, but in the 14th century narrative, it makes more sense as it's a snake's tail that hangs out and drips poison into a punch bowl. Anyway, the streamlining of the lengthy medieval story into a simple folk tale reaches this extreme in certain cases where nothing remains of Mélusine or her story but her mournful howl. In the 1886 volume, Legend Book of the Ore Mountains by Johann Ernst, we learn of a superstition held in a region along the modern border of Germany and the Czech Republic. Namely that
during a windstorm, they say that Mélusine is crying for her children.
And that
on Christmas Eve, they would shake the leftovers from the tablecloth onto a bush so that Mélusine might have something to eat.
Related folklore is widely spread throughout the Czech Republic, where Mélusine, as she's called, became exclusively an embodiment of the winds and is imagined as a woman dressed in white with long, flowing hair. The custom, still widely remembered, is to leave for her on Christmas Eve a few pinches of salt or flour outside on a windowsill or fence post, or to leave nuts and apples indoors next to the chimney through which she howls. It was also once said that her wailing betokened misfortune, as in our earlier stories, but these negative aspects of the folklore are largely forgotten, though Mélusine is not, and is mentioned in a number of songs sung by Czech children around Christmas. Let's hope they leave out a bit of salt and flour for the poor, diminished wind fairy.